Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our second panel. Just before I move to introduce the speakers, I just want to give a shout out for my colleague Donatas Kupsiunas, who's sitting at the back in a very quiet and retiring way, which is his personality. But he's actually played the key role in putting this event together. And though his personal research expertise isn't in the areas covered here, therefore he hasn't been on the panel, his concept behind it has been very powerful. So I want to thank Donatas for his work in putting this together. As I say, we are now moving to the second panel, and the first speaker for this here is Jørgen Staun, who's an associate professor at the Royal Danish Defence College. The whole theme of this session is to move towards the hard security issues. We began to do that a bit at the end of the first session, but I'm really hoping we can illuminate those discussions. So Jørgen, we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm with the Royal Danish Defence College, and my main area is Russian foreign security policy, and has been for some time. This presentation, I put up two papers there if you're interested in reading more on this. Unfortunately, they're in Danish still, and the co-authored with Anders Puk Nielsen from the Institute from the Royal Danish Defence College, and he's a naval officer, so I'm a civilian, and so therefore the military parts in it you should ask him those questions on that. I might be able to answer some of them. Yes. Well, one of the official Russian objectives in invading Ukraine in February 2022 was to keep the US and NATO at a safe distance from Russia's borders. But one of the side effects of that invasion is that Finland has become a member of NATO, and Sweden is hopefully soon to follow. This means that Russia will have a new and very long land border with NATO, and that the entire security geography of the Baltic Sea region is changing. Membership of NATO will, seen in isolation, increase Sweden's and Finland's, and thereby Denmark's security against Russian intimidation and ultimately invasion. And both Finland and Sweden strengthen NATO's northern European flank by adding modern, capable military forces. But there's a real risk that Sweden and Finland's capable membership in the long run will increase Russian insecurity and mistrust of NATO, leading the Kremlin to launch military measures in the northwest of Russia that increase the threat to NATO in that area, which will then we'll basically have to arm ourselves further to mitigate that increased risk. And in other words, there's a risk that the security dilemma between the US, NATO on one hand, and Russia on the other hand, will worsen in this area, and that this will also affect the Baltic Sea region. If you look at security dilemma theory, there are three key variables that influence a security dilemma between two countries or groups of countries, if you ask John Hertz or Robert Jervis especially. The first is the degree of uncertainty and mutual distrust between countries. The second is the question of whether the geography or the terrain promotes the defense or enables military advance or promotes the offensive. The third variable is whether weapons technology favors the defense or the offensive. The most dangerous situation is one where there's a high degree of mistrust and where both geography and weapons technology promote the offensive mindset, while at the same time it being difficult to distinguish what is actually defensive and offensive actions. The degree of uncertainty and mutual distrust between the US, NATO, and Russia is very high. It's extremely high, actually. In NATO, concerns about Russia's intentions and military capabilities have been steadily growing since the annexation of Crimea back in March 2014. NATO's latest strategic concept from June 22 calls Russia the most significant and direct threat to allies' security, and it accuses Russia of seeking spheres of influence and direct control through coercion, subversion, aggression, and annexation. And I think a lot of Ukrainians could sign to that also. US President Joe Biden has called Putin a war criminal and has spearheaded a sweeping sanctions program against the Russian elite and an equally sweeping arms aid and financial support package for the Ukraine, and support from Europe has followed suit. And not only with helmets and protective gear, as it was in the beginning, now it's Leopard tanks and F-16. Nor is Russia characterized by trust in its counterparts, the US/NATO. Overall, Russia feels threatened by NATO, and its military doctrines highlight in particular the US-NATO missile shield, the US global prompt strike concept, and the increased US focus on military use of space. These are, all three of them, perceived as attempts to undermine Russia's ability to retaliate against the first strike, including with nuclear weapons. In addition, Russia has long been concerned with what it sees as as the West's penchant for exporting democracy and supporting colored revolutions, which Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov has previously described as coup d'etat perpetrated from the outside, by the West, that is. The Russian elite seems to be in the process of convincing itself that NATO, by its open door policy, forced Russia to invade Ukraine, and that Russia in Ukraine is fighting a proxy war with the US, NATO. So they believe they are at war with us, even though we don't really think that we are at war with them. That could lead to misunderstandings. Russia does not look favorably on Swedish and Finnish NATO membership. Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu stated on 21st of December 2022 that Russia would have to respond to the admission by creating an appropriate group of forces in the northwest of Russia. Gerasimov has spoken of creating a new army corps in Karelia. An army corps that's between 45 and 65,000 personnel. They talked about creating a new military district in Moscow and one in Leningrad region around St. Petersburg to defend that. But of course, nothing has been said of where the troops and the equipment will come from. However, Putin has stressed that, and I quote, "We have no limitations in terms of funding," unquote. In my view, this is a long shot. Russia will be conventionally weak for a long time after the Ukraine war, whenever that ends, perhaps 5 to 10 years time it will take to rebuild forces and manpower. It's also a long shot from my side, I should say. Instead, Russia is likely to put more emphasis on nuclear deterrence, as it did in the 1990s when they were conventionally weak. And this is important since this affects the Baltic Sea region through the proximity to the Arctic waters, just on the other side of Denmark. If you look at the geography, Finnish and Swedish membership of NATO will add a 1,340 kilometer long land border to Russia. And with the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO, all littoral states except Russia will be members of the Western Alliance. Therefore, the Baltic Sea will be transformed, or is transformed, into something close as a NATO lake. Seen from a purely military point of view, the Baltic Sea is one big coastal zone, as ships are always within firing range from land, and therefore maritime issues must be seen in the context of the military dynamics on land. What the Russians are learning right now, the hard way in the Black Sea, NATO should watch closely and think what to do in the Baltic Sea. With the Baltic Sea as something close to a NATO lake, NATO will have a significantly increased operational freedom. In addition, the amount of regional infrastructure and forces that Russia would have to deal with in a conflict with NATO has increased. Today, Finland officially has a wartime strength of some 280,000 soldiers. They have a peacetime force around 21,500 officially, and officially they have a reserve force of up to 900,000 personnel. And although much of the Finnish army concentrates on regional and local defense, around 20% of the army is modern maneuver units and includes 2 mechanized brigades, 2 armored regimental combat teams, and special forces. The army's equipment is relatively modern, and according to the Swedish Defense Research Agency, the FOI, consists of some 100 Leopard 2A6 tanks, 212 armored personnel carriers, and large quantities of rocket artillery, etc., etc. So they have a fairly large force compared to other Nordic countries. These units, seen through Russian eyes, could threaten the lines of communication to Murmansk on the Kola Peninsula, which in effect consists of the E-105 highway and the Murmansk Railway. Thus, the risk for Russia is that the Finnish armed forces, together with NATO forces, would be able to disrupt or perhaps even block access. This threatens the logistical support of parts of Russia's nuclear retaliation capability, as about 2/3 of Russian sea-based nuclear weapons, mainly located on submarines, are under the command of the Northern Fleet, whose bases are on the Kola Peninsula. So they're actually fairly vulnerable up there, or it's a very important area, at least for the Russians. From a Russian perspective, the bases themselves are also under threat, as there is, for example, only some 188 kilometers from the Finnish border to Zapadnaya-Litsa, home base of the new Russian Yasen-class nuclear attack submarines, which they place great hope in. NATO could, seen through Russian eyes, use Göteborg as port of call and Lapland in northern Sweden and Finland and northern Norway as a staging area for an attack on Murmansk, threatening the Russian nuclear second strike capability. At the same time, NATO enlargement makes it difficult for Russia in a crisis situation to secure supplies to and defend the exclave of Kaliningrad, which is locked in, you could say, by NATO countries between Lithuania and Poland. And Russia's increased Belarusian military integration would have given it a better chance of blocking the so-called Slovakia gap between Kaliningrad and Belarus, through which NATO forces have so far had to pass if they wanted to help the Baltic states from the land side. Enlargement with Finland has to some extent thwarted this by securing new access routes for NATO forces. The Russian metropolis of St. Petersburg is also more exposed by the Finnish membership, just as the Russian Baltic Fleet will find it extremely difficult to operate anywhere in the Baltic Sea, that is, but especially in the Gulf of Finland, which is between 80 and 120 kilometers wide, especially if Finland and Estonia coordinate their coastal defenses. Thus, there's a large risk that Swedish and especially Finnish membership of NATO will increase the Russian sense of vulnerability in the western and especially in the northern military district. If you look at weapons technology, Russia is particularly concerned about NATO's military technological superiority, not least in the conventional field. Russia has watched from the sidelines as the US and NATO waged high-tech wars in in Iraq, that was a US-led operation, and in Libya, for example, to great military effect, at least initially. Finnish and Swedish membership will not change much on this account. However, Finland's purchase of 64 F-35 fighter jets to replace the aging F-18 Hornets is worth noticing. The F-35 is comparable to a flying technology platform loaded with sensors that can detect targets on the ground. It can control weapons platforms. It can engage targets. And it's the Russian S-300, S-400, and perhaps even the S-500 air defense systems will have a hard time to see the aircraft until it may be too late. With Finland as a member of NATO, the Nordic NATO countries will have more than 140 F-35 aircraft available by 2030, perhaps even more. Denmark there's lots of talk of Denmark buying more, and so that we could chip in also. Sweden has a well-equipped fleet, modern air defense systems, and announced in 2020 that it will increase its defense spending by 40% by 2025. It's to be expected that Sweden will also invest in weapon systems that support its integration into NATO. And the fact that these two countries enter NATO with well-functioning, updated forces and relatively good possibilities to finance the procurement of advanced military equipment contributes to the fact that the accession of Finland and Sweden poses a technological challenge for Russia. NATO's primary task in this area is to secure the integrity of its eastern borders. This poses some very practical challenges in terms of relatively strength and response time. Overall, NATO is significantly stronger militarily than Russia and Belarus, but locally this is not necessarily the case in many of the countries. Only Poland and to some extent Finland has a military force that is likely to be strong enough to defend its territory independently against the Russian attack and keep the Russian forces at bay until NATO forces arrive. This means that NATO is dependent on being able to move the necessary reinforcements to the affected countries in a situation of tension. And if NATO fails to anticipate a Russian attack, if it comes, it risks having to retake lost territory from an unfavorable position under the threat of nuclear war. Denmark is not a frontline state like it was during the Cold War. Denmark's role in NATO's defense of the Baltic Sea region is to support the reinforcement of the eastern borders. Denmark does this basically in three ways. First, Denmark itself contributes soldiers. A medium brigade is currently being established to fulfill this role. It's somewhat delayed, of course, which is why the heavy brigade due to be on 90 days notice in 2032 is also delayed. Secondly, Denmark is acting as a host nation for other countries' forces that are to be deployed in the fight. To receive, the roles are basically to receive, to stage and secure onward movement of forces. In particular, the port in Esbjerg will play a key role in receiving foreign soldiers and military equipment. The third task locally is to keep the Danish Straits open so that NATO can move freely in and out of the Baltic Sea. From a Russian point of view, it would be obvious to try to close Storebælt, Øresund, and the Kieler Canal, as this would reduce the number of NATO ships in the Baltic Sea. This could be done, for example, by mining the straits from aircraft or from submarines, or by various forms of sabotage against shipping. In addition, Russia has long-range anti-ship missiles capable of reaching the Danish Straits. There's therefore a need for a good surveillance of both the waters and the airspace around Danish straits so that threats can be detected and dealt with, if that's possible. Let me sort of sum up. Finland and Sweden's membership, Swedish future membership of NATO increases both countries' security against Russian intimidation and invasion. Both countries strengthen NATO's northern flank, and so basically their membership strengthened Denmark's territorial security, and it strengthens the Danish position not being a frontline state as it was during the Cold War. But there's a real risk that Sweden's and Finland's membership will increase Russian insecurity and mistrust of NATO, leading to the Kremlin to launch some kind of military measures in the northwest that will then again increase the threat to NATO, which will then have to arm itself further. So basically, I think there's a risk that in the coming years, in the time after the war in Ukraine, that there's a risk that the security dilemma between the US, NATO, and Russia will worsen, and that this will also affect security in the Baltic Sea region. If you look at the situation today, it's limited what Russia can really challenge NATO with in the short term. Initially, any increase in Russian force generation will be hampered by the heavy losses of troops and equipment in Ukraine. In addition, Russian economic growth is expected to slow, and access to Western technology is limited, or is being limited, and will be limited in the coming years due to sanctions. This makes a large-scale build-up of sophisticated weapon systems difficult, unless, of course, that they get help from China. Conversely, Russia's marked weakness in the conventional field could lead to an increased emphasis on nuclear deterrence. Not only will this emphasis on nuclear deterrence on nuclear weapons be higher, but the barrier to deployment in a conflict may be correspondingly lower. This was certainly the case in the 90s in Russian strategic papers when Russia was conventionally weaker. And if you look through in the Russian media these days, there's lots of nuclear scaremongery, which is, of course, Russian instrumental use of this nuclear threat perceptions on Western audiences, so that we don't support Ukraine as much as we do. But I think it also has an effect on Russia itself, or on the Russian debate, noticing Russian intellectuals like Karaganov, Dmitry Trenin, Lukhanov advising the presidential administration to use nuclear weapons on Poland just to teach NATO a lesson, so that we can get the deterrence by nuclear weapons, this feeling strong again. And that debate, I don't think that there's lots of other possibilities for Putin to do before using nuclear weapons, and I think that the analysis is that it's not a wise direction to go, but it radicalizes the Russian debate, and it might have effect on other areas of Russian thinking. So, thank you.
Jørgen, thank you very, very much indeed. That was a magisterial overview of the current hard security situation in the region, and helps our conversation tremendously. As in the first session, we'll move to a panel discussion slightly later on, but our second presenter is Kristian Søby, who is the head of the Centre for Military Studies at the University of Copenhagen, Just to say that Kristian and his colleagues have been in partnership with our centre in what we call the Baltic Geopolitics Network, a network of about 20 universities around the region, and we try and develop our collaborations in a variety of different ways, and that's gradually moving forward and producing some quite interesting events and discussions. I should mention that also in Denmark, the University of Southern Denmark is also one of our collaborators, but actually the Centre for Military Studies at Copenhagen has been the first of our collaborators from when we started. And so, Kristian, we're delighted that you're able to make a presentation this morning.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I also want to thank you, Charles, and your team for setting this up, and of course also thanks to the embassy for hosting it. I think it's most valuable, and as the previous panel noted, that the timing was perfect. Unfortunately so, but still important, right? So Jørgen hardly stole some of my thunder, but I think it may be worthwhile to sort of delve a bit more into some of the considerations and some of the fundamental changes that the security situation has led to, and some of the decisions that have been taken are underway in Denmark, and also to sort of focus on the changing role of Denmark in the Baltic Sea region, both because Denmark, as has been noted with the Straits, has an important geography in and of itself, but also because some of the issues and challenges that Denmark are facing, of course, is also some that are shared by the region as a whole. So I think I'll start off obviously with noting the obvious, right? That the Russian invasion is a watershed moment in Danish defense and security politics, but also I think in Danish sort of foreign policy history. And I think but I think that's an important point, not just the Russian invasion, but to an equal extent, the subsequent events have fundamentally changed threat perceptions in Denmark, has changed Danish military geography, and therefore also changed the drivers of defense planning. As Jørgen said, Denmark is basically now a staging area. And that is a completely new military geography. And that role as an enabling partner, or as an enabling point for the Allied effort in the Baltic Sea region is something new for Denmark. But also the membership of Finland and potentially Sweden, of course, changes the whole region, and also therefore changes Denmark's position in it. But the first thing to notice is I think that Russia's invasion, as for Germany, also led to a Zeitenwende in Denmark, right? To a fundamental rethink of a lot of givens in Danish defense and security policy that a refocused or a re-emphasized focus on the regional defense and security and on defense and deterrence in NATO was merited. But I think, again, comparing it to the German Zeitenwende has also have some merit in the sense that this Zeitenwende in Denmark is a long and complicated process, right? It's not something that happens from one day to the other. It is really a long and a cumbersome and a complicated defense transformation process that is underway that will need to work both in terms of changing the organization of the armed forces, changing the role, being to a certain extent a staging area, but also therefore changing the mindset of the armed forces, and broadening it out outside Denmark, also changing what partners Denmark will have, or the strategic meaning of Danish partners. And this Zeitenwende, that is not something that happens in a moment, but actually takes some time, is ongoing as we speak, right? The Danish, the defense agreement that the government sort of proposed and got majority through Parliament is being implemented, or being thought through, as it actually is, as we speak, before it can be implemented. So complex political and military dialogue, or even negotiations, are going on at the moment. And of course, I think one other issue to bear in mind is that when one thinks about Danish defense and security, they are always also related to alliance politics, right? Partners and allies play a super important role, and I think one of the key things is that looking back, Jørgen, you mentioned Denmark had a different military geographical role during the Cold War, but I think the point is actually that since the end of the Cold War, Danish geography has played no sense in military, played no role in a military sense, right? The Danish defense and security has been completely globalized, meaning that it was political preferences that drove Danish interlocutors and partners. That has fundamentally changed now. Geography matters in Danish defense and security again, putting premium in a different way on different partners within the region or outside the region. And basically it means that the Danish defense relations are in a from west to east relationship, right? I'll get back to that because I think the changes or the fundamental changes or sort of reinterpretation of the geopolitical situation of Denmark that follows on the Russian invasion leads to three military challenges and three defense policy challenges. And I'll go a bit into detail on all six of them, and hopefully they will then nicely segue into a debate and discussion together with Jørgen afterwards. But if we start with the military challenges, one of them evidently is about the new role as a staging area. How does Denmark do host nation support? What kind of military organization is necessary for that? How do you work with new or other partners or same partners in a new way, making sure that you are able to provide the services and the security and the infrastructure, both military and civilian, that is necessary for the forces that need to sort of transit Denmark as they move from the North Sea or from the Atlantic through Denmark, through the Danish Straits into the Baltic Sea, or as Jørgen mentioned, all the way up to Finland. That then leads to the question of, and that's the second challenge, how then should Denmark defend Danish territory? So there's a territorial defense component to this that has got something to do with host nation support, but not only because, as Jørgen also told us, Russian military force has the standoff capability to reach Danish territory. So Denmark also needs to think about how to do national territorial defense, as was the case in the Cold War, but in a different sense, because Denmark is not a frontline state, but still needs to defend itself from Russian military capabilities. So that means thinking new about what to defend, how to defend it, and what kind of defense planning, what kind of refocusing of the Danish armed forces that whole process requires. And then, thirdly, what I've called expeditionary deterrence, and it's a concept that I just came up with as I was preparing my comments. So don't Google it too much; it won't lead you into that many sort of long and thorough academic explanations. But the point I want to highlight with it is that the Danish armed forces come from a tradition of being expeditionary, right? Especially together with our partners in this room. The UK, Danish Armed Forces for the last 20 years have been focused on thinking about culturally adapting to and planning for expeditionary warfare in the global south. That has changed now, but differently from Poland, from the Baltic states, and Finland, and to a certain extent also Sweden, Denmark is not supposed to do deterrence on Danish territory. No, the brigade that Jørgen talked about needs to be deployable. It needs to be ready not only to deploy to the shores of Sealand, it needs to be able to deploy to wherever it is that NATO thinks that it should be part of NATO's extended deterrence, right? So that means maintaining a substantial logistical capability and the storages, the ammunitions, the planning to move larger and heavier military formations at a very short notice, which is a completely different planning regime than was the one that guided Danish sort of expeditionary warfare in the global south. So that is a very tough challenge for the Danish armed forces to do this kind of triple transformation, in the sense that it both needs to prepare and invest significantly in armed forces that can actually travel outside the country to participate in NATO's defense and deterrence. Needs to think about and invest in territorial defense, and needs to think about and invest in host nation support, or what in a wider sense in NATO is known as enablement, namely enabling the whole shift of forces from east to west. And this military challenge, of course, is then, and I want to highlight that because it also ties into the previous panel, is that thinking about these issues is not only something that is needed in a war situation, right? You need to think through how the Danish armed forces contribute to these three tasks, both in peace and in crisis and in war, right? Because the whole thing is about deterrence and sending signals, but that also means that you need to be prepared to use your military force to send signals and to be vigilant and to survey and be present also in peacetime, right? And I'm not saying that the Danish armed forces should be on a 2-day call-up throughout the year, but there are tasks that need to be considered, and you need to think about how you go from peace crisis into wartime. And that is, of course, a national issue, but also something that needs to be considered in an alliance context, right? So three new tasks: host nation support, territorial defense in a new version, different from the Cold War, and then contributing to deterrence in NATO that goes on outside Danish territory. So those were the three military challenges, and I think they are, in addition to those, I think there are three sort of wider defense policy challenges that also needs to be taken into consideration. And I think the first one follows from the previous panel, but also from what I said just before, that Denmark, along with its partners in the region, needs to organize for full spectrum conflict. And now I'm not talking about, what I want to highlight with this is not that Denmark needs to prepare for like a conventional war with Russia, because that is going to happen in the NATO defense planning process without Denmark having to pay that much attention to it. What I want to underline with that is there's a lot of things going on in peacetime, in the gray zone, where the Danish armed forces also need to figure out what their role is. How do you sort of split the pie between civil and military when it comes to cyber, when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to information security? There is a complex cross-sectoral debate about authority, about decision-making power that needs to be thought through in order to be able to handle the threat landscape in the Baltic Sea region. The second one, I think I sort of highlighted that I will get into that is the changing relationship between Danish partners, or the changing relationship with Denmark and its key interlocutors. The basic tendency is that of course, if the strategic movement that is important for Danish military geography is from east to west, that also means that Denmark will have new partners going from east to west, and I think that underlines probably a strengthened relationship with the United States, as it's to a large extent is U.S. troops that are going to be transported from west to east, but it probably also is the case for the United Kingdom, underlining a sort of traditional relationship between Denmark and the UK in terms of making sure that US or UK reinforcement can also traverse Danish territory. But it also underlines the countries that are close to Denmark, namely Germany, Sweden, and Norway. Those are the obvious and immediate partners you need to work with in order to ensure the Danish territory, and especially the Danish Strait. And it's not that Denmark has not cooperated with Germany, Sweden, and Norway before, but it has been in a different way and with different missions set in mind. And then, of course, as troops moves further east, it also creates new relations to the Baltic states. That is also a big part of discussions in NATO at the moment with reforming the command structure. And then to complicate it even more, Denmark is, as it's said in one of the old sort of romanticist songs, is situated between two oceans. Right? In the song, it's the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, but in strategic sense, it's the Baltic Sea and the Arctic. So a defense policy challenge in Denmark is also how to balance the demand for Danish armed forces and Danish military presence in both the Baltic Sea and the Arctic region. So there's a lot to talk about. And I hope that we can talk more about that and how to engage with the threat from Russia in the Q&A, which I look very much forward to. Thank you so much.
Kristian, that was absolutely tremendous. Now, Jørgen, do you want to join the panel again? We've had two fantastic presentations, I'm sure you'll all agree, and raising a whole set of serious questions. We've got about 3/4 of an hour to talk, so there's plenty of time, but I'm going to usurp my position here to kick off with a couple of questions to the two panelists before moving more widely, both of which refer to what has been said. My first question is that often in the quotes West, because of worries about military conflict, we resort to using sanctions as a device to deal with people who we think are behaving unacceptably, and that of course is classically happened in relation to Russia. But we had some comments in this morning's panel earlier on about whether that was working or not. You've talked, both of you, about the military hard security situations, but I'd welcome any observations either or both of you had on the validity or use or worth of a sanctions-based approach to trying to inhibit the behavior of Russia in particular, but also any other particular challenger. I say it because for I think in political circles, I don't know whether David, with his experience, would agree or not, it's often easy to think of sanctions because that's not really a hard, problematic thing, rather than military action. So we duck out to go for sanctions, but actually, do they work? And so I just wondered any observations either of you had on that.
Well, one of the main objects of the sanctions regime, which started, the large part of it started in 2014 after the first war in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. They had the intention to, on one hand, send a signal of deterrence to Russia that this was a bad policy to do. On the other hand, it had the intention of trying to split the elite. So if you can hit the people around Putin on their pocket, or the pocket money, their financials, then you might split the elite and lower the support for Putin's policies. It didn't really work. It had the effect that the next year China was the largest trade partner to Russia. And the sanctions that have been in place since 2022, which are of course much harsher, they haven't had the effect on the war either, in the sense that they haven't. The basic idea was again deterrence, that Russia should be punished, so that in the hope that it would think twice in another war or in that war in Ukraine, and it hasn't had any effect on the behavior of Russian troops or on the political goals of the elite. They will in the long run affect Russia's ability to behave as a great power, in the sense that one of the side effects, or one of the effects of the sanctions, is that the technology transfer to Russia is diminished quite substantially. There were more than 1,000 Western companies that left Russia in the period immediately after the invasion and after the sanctions placed, and that will, I suspect, have an effect on the technological transfer to Russian companies. It hasn't really affected the Russian economy as much as we hoped, and neither were the visa regulations or the SWIFT regulations had any effect, really. So they haven't had the deterrence effect on Russia as we hoped.
Thank you. Kristian, do you have anything to add on this?
No, I think I largely agree that the sort of the first function of the sanction was basically to deter Russia from attack, and evidently they failed on that, right? And now they sort of changed from being an instrument that should deter Russia from being an instrument that is going to punish or weaken Russia. And I think that of course is in a sense we as the West are in an economic war with Russia. May not be a military conflict, but from an economic perspective, it is using economic means to degrade Russia's ability to wage war, but also to function as Jørgen said, as a great power. And that of course is a long game. And so I think it's perhaps too early to say what effect the sanction will have on Russia's economy, because when you are such a relatively great economy as Russia, there is a lot of things you can do to sort of keep the wheels turning. So we need to see what happens. One of the things where I think long term perhaps this will have an effect is, in addition to what Jørgen mentioned about sort of high tech weapons production, is also the know-how that Russia also depends on in sort of recapitalizing its natural resources sector, not least oil and gas, where it needs needs investment, but also Western know-how. I'm not sure that it can change to China very easily, but there may be some in the audience who have more insight on that than I have.
Short comment on that. The first round of sanctions in 2014, they were a chapter specifically directed on Western companies' involvement in exploration of oil and gas in the Arctic, offshore on the continental shelf. That meant that the previous policy of Russia, which was to attract Western companies, especially to help them develop these hard-to-access areas, it was stopped basically, and I don't see that coming up shortly. They have tried to replace it with Chinese investments and with the help of Chinese energy companies, but as of yet, they haven't really been successful.
Thank you. My second question is about nuclear weapons, which were referred to there. And I think the phrase used, Jørgen, was an increased emphasis by Russia on nuclear deterrence. And of course, a lot of scaremongering of various kinds, and then not scaremongering, but reality. A lot of talk about installing nuclear weapons in Belarus, and also whether and to what extent they exist in Kaliningrad. I've always found this quite difficult, because I can't quite see how the Russians could successfully use nuclear weapons in a way that wasn't almost as damaging for themselves as it was for anyone else in this kind of area. But that's my lack of military expertise speaking. So can you both discuss a little bit what the nuclear dimension of all this is, because certainly in opinion forming circles in the West, I'd say it is a real concern. People are worried about it, but they don't quite know how to discuss it, if I can put it like that. I'd welcome Kristian. Do you want to kick off?
I think Jørgen, you should go first. You know more about Russian thinking on nuclear issues than I do.
It's from a doctrinal level, it's fairly clear that Russia can use, if it follows its own regulations and laws, the nuclear doctrine and military doctrine, they can use nuclear weapons if Russia is attacked with nuclear weapons, if the state is experiencing an existential threat, or some of its allies have been in that situation. And then there are a number of areas where they, for instance, if it's attacked with strategic missiles, which could be armed with nuclear warheads, they are allowed to use nuclear weapons, and further technical areas. But basically, in the interpretation that Russia would be or the Russian government would be in a existential crisis, the Russian state would be in an existential crisis due to the war in Ukraine, is well, they will have to interpret that doctrine substantially, I think. That doesn't mean that they can't use it, because it's not. We cannot, of course, be sure that they will not use, or that they will follow their own regulations. I don't think that this. So far, at least, the Russian position, or the position from Putin's side, has been fairly clearly that this is not necessary, and it will not. And the position of the Russian military has been that it's not really feasible to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, in the Ukraine war. The radiation will, of course, be very well. Will make it hard to operate in these areas, and if it's supposed to be Russian land afterwards, it will be contaminated. So it's a last resort. China has signaled very clearly that they will not accept it, and the U.S. has signaled that if Russia uses nuclear weapons in Ukraine, they will conventionally hit all the Russian troops that they can see in Ukraine and in the Black Sea. So that's a fairly clear deterrent, I think, which will make Russia think twice, or Putin think twice. What bothers me is this debate that I talked about with Karaganov, Dmitry Trenin, and Fyodor Lukhanov, which are sensible people, smart analysts. I've interviewed Dmitry Trenin many times. I've interviewed Lukhanov several times, and Karaganov also. I used to be a correspondent for Danish Daily and for Berlingske Tidende from 2002 to 2004, so it's a long time ago. And back then, Karaganov was a geopolitician. He was a realist, a classical realist, really. Now he's using metaphors or argumental structure which draws upon God or religion in arguing why it's advisable to use nuclear weapons, as well as deterrence logic. Dmitry Trenin and Lukhanov have together with Karaganov, who's obviously the lead author of this report to the presidential administration, which has been leaked and which is most likely an instrumental leak in order to scare the West. But in that report, I see a definite change of what is right and wrong and what is normality over the years that I've followed these people over the years. And so there's something happening in the Russian elite. These guys are a part of the analytical elite. They're not, I think that Karaganov has met Putin several times, but he's not really in any kind of inner circle. But who in the presidential administration is it that asked for such a report, and with what purpose? And then part of that report also suggests that they should resettle 1 to 2 million Ukrainians to Siberia, that they should use prisoners of war to build roads and infrastructure, which we've done before in history, etc., etc. It sounds really radicalized in my opinion, and I find it troubling that this is the level of the debate. And if you open Twitter and you see Solovjov or any of the other propagandists, they talk about bombing London once in a while with nuclear weapons and leveling it and other countries, and it's a disturbing way to discuss, I think.
Thank you very much. Kristian, would you like to add?
Yeah, no, just to make it even more disturbing, perhaps by yes. By complementing what Jørgen said about sort of the radicalization of the, if one could call it, the strategic intellectual environment in Russia, with sort of more general trends when it comes to the nuclear area. Some people talk about that the world is entering into a third nuclear age, right? That nuclear weapons are back on the global agenda, and so that is in a sense a consequence of increased great power competition, where Russia is just a minor part, but still they have a substantial amount of nuclear weapons. But this is also something to do with competition between the US and China, meaning a number of things: that all of the major nuclear powers are investing in new nuclear technologies, and Russia sees itself and also sees its investments in new nuclear technologies as one of the areas where it can sort of show off its great power status. Some of these new technologies are potentially destabilizing, hypersonic missiles, but also other kinds of delivery systems that sort of, again, as Jørgen stated, sort of puts a premium on the offensive, on first strike. Another tendency or another technological development is that is to a large extent also what is worrying the Russians, is that a number of non-nuclear technologies have such effect or power that they can also put second strike capabilities at risk, again destabilizing the situation. And then in general, there seems to be a tendency of wanting from the nuclear great powers of having more freedom of action than limiting themselves in more perhaps stabilizing arms control regimes, right? Everything is falling apart. So we are moving into a general more nuclear-based world order that is less stable, even without considering Jørgen's radicalization story from Russia. So deeply concerning, both globally, but of course also, final point, also locally, in a sense that a lot of the Russian nuclear focus is also on developing dual-capable delivery systems, meaning and with local range, right? So there could rapidly become also a local nuclearization of the Baltic Sea region.
Thank you both very, very much. By the way, on our website, there is a discussion and a conversation that I had with Dmitry Trenin about 2 years ago, following an article he'd written about the future of the Baltic, to talk about some of these questions. My final question I'm just going to ask, and then I'll throw it open completely, and so please be preparing what it is you would like to ask. And my final question is about Kaliningrad, a strange exclave, as people say, in all of this. And I just wonder how you think we should be thinking about the future of Kaliningrad in any evolution of the current situation. My worry in the UK is we have very, very little expertise at all about Kaliningrad. What do people who currently live in Kaliningrad think about the current state of affairs? What do they think about the regime? What are the potential futures? And I'd just be interested in any insights. It does relate to the nuclear point, obviously, given what the Russians have said, but any insights either of you have on the Kaliningrad situation, I'd be very interested. Kristian, do you want to kick off?
No, so I don't know anything about what happens in Kaliningrad at all. So I won't say anything about that. But evidently, it's the pivot of Jørgen's whole argument, in the sense that the existence of Kaliningrad is, I think, in and of itself destabilizing in the Baltic Sea region, because seen from a Western perspective, it's like a forward deployed Russian missile battery. And from the Russian perspective, it's a very hard to defend piece of Russian territory, right? So both parties see Kaliningrad producing enormous vulnerability to both sides. So from a strategic perspective, it is concerning, and this is also, at least at the moment, where Russia has based most of the Baltic Sea fleet. So there's a lot of, from Russia perspective, important infrastructure that of course gives Russia some capability in the region, but also makes it very vulnerable from a Russian perspective. And again, to underline one of the comments made in the previous section, is that a lot of stuff goes on in the Baltic Sea. It is a very congested space in terms of civilian maritime traffic, in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of military presence. Right? So if you want to do a naval exercise in the Baltic Sea, you inevitably come close to Kaliningrad. Or if you are Russians, if you want to do a naval exercise in the Baltic Sea, you inevitably come close to NATO territory.
Thank you. Jørgen?
Yeah, well, to support what Kristian said, the debate in Russian military academia, which is public, the talk on or the what they talk about is exactly the vulnerability of the Kaliningrad region, and some of the scenarios that they play out and which they've exercised is to use forces from Belarus to move in and close the Suwalki Gap and support Kaliningrad. As my naval officer colleague Anders Buk Nielsen states, that in a conflict scenario with NATO, the Russian Baltic Fleet would cease to exist in a matter of hours or days. That's of course what the Russians said about the Ukrainian ability to defend itself, but let's forget that for a second. But essentially, the vulnerability of that enclave of the Russian Baltic Fleet is high. It will be very hard to operate in the Baltic Sea, and they have very few ships there. So it's not the question of Denmark blocking the straits so that to keep the Russian fleet in. It's the opposite, to keep the straits open, to get NATO fleet into the Baltic. Yes, that's what else.
Okay, thank you both very much. We've had a fantastic set of events, and I'm now throwing it open. I can see there's already a lot of people who want to contribute. I'll go first to right at the back. Donatas, could you just introduce yourself and ask your question?
Yes, thank you so much for your excellent presentations. I'm Donatas Kupčiūnas. I'm a Baltic Fellow at the Center for Geopolitics, and Charles is my boss, actually.
Not true. By the way, not true.
Better ask a good question. It seems to me that Western strategy towards Ukraine and Russia, at least recently, if there ever was one, it has been based on this hope of regime change in Russia. The idea that by sanctioning the hell out of Russia, by supplying weapons to Ukraine, we're going to achieve something like the downfall of Putin's regime, essentially. And afterwards, some sort of Russia like it was in the 90s, which is relatively harmless. I remember all these, conferences just when this war started, and this idea of regime change in Russia was really in the air. People were talking about it as if it was almost like a done deal, basically. Looking at it today, would you say that this idea of regime change is dead in the water, or do you still see a possibility of Putin's regime crumbling, another Prigozhin coming to the throne of Russia, or some hypothetical liberals, or another faction in the Kremlin trying to end this war? Or are you an optimist or a pessimist in this case? Thank you.
Yes or no?
Yes or no? I'm not an optimist. In Western-induced change of the Kremlin or regime change is not going to happen. End of story. Internally, there might be warlords in a fragile situation that would start warring with each other and competing and securing their own goods and the money that they've stolen over the years, using the private military companies that they've been building up. Prigozhin was, of course, shot down or bombed out of business. But Wagner and Wagner as such does not really exist. But the private military companies are still actively taking part in the war in Ukraine. Now the whole part of the whole process was to get Wagner under the command of the defense ministry, or defense ministry private military companies, basically. And that process is happening now. And if you ask a British scholar on this, Mark Galeotti, who follows this very closely, and a good colleague of mine, Randbo, who's been working for the Danish Defense College, what is happening, what could happen in a situation where Putin is weakened because the war is not going the way that they want, because of lots of people being killed, or Russian soldiers being killed, and because of the sanctions, because of the endless war in Ukraine, that at some point the elite decides, or the people around Putin decides that he's too old now and he should be retired. Then we could have a situation where they start competing with each other, with using the means that they have, well, that would be a very unpleasant, a very uncontrollable, fluid situation. It could also be that if the elite decides that Putin is about to retire, that they agree on a successor. I don't know who that would be at present, but in terms of the Russian constitution, it would be Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin who should take over, and he's a liberal in the economic sense. He's been keeping out of these internal wars, and he's not saying harsh things on Ukraine, so he would definitely be the choice of the West. But I don't really see him being too favorable or acceptable for the FSB. I think that anybody who would take over the presidency after Putin would have to say some of the same things about the Ukraine war, that it's because of so many Russian soldiers at present being killed, and you can just keep that movement going for a long time. Anybody who sits in the presidential chair will have to say some of the same things that Putin does in order to keep the army and the FSB happy. So that person will have to be agreeable for the security forces and for the army. Otherwise, the war has been a waste of money and of lives, and that's simply not acceptable. So you have this Russian notion of being a great power and having the right to access or to privilege in its near abroad a Russian historical right to parts of Ukraine territory. You'll have that imperialist thinking in place also in a successor. That's my belief.
Kristian, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think either there is a Russian sue for peace that requires a replacement of Putin, where there's the same regime structure that continues just with a new figurehead because they want to sue for peace. Jørgen just said that is unlikely. Then there's another option that is a completely new regime, i.e. something new. And my sense is that that's probably, if that happens, going to be even more nationalist or imperialist than the current one. And then there's the third possible option, which is a disintegration of the Russian Federation, that it sort of tries to lose control of the fringe areas. And I don't see any of them as that significant. I think we sometimes underestimate the robustness of societies in war situations, that they have much more resilience than we think, and that goes for Germany during World War II, Russia now. You could also point to Iran during the Iran-Iraq war. The rebels in Syria is another example of civilian population being willing to withstand an enormous amount of punishment. Ukraine.
Thank you. You want to ask? Can you just introduce yourself, please? And I'll just keep my eye. You first.
Thank you. Ambassador of Lithuania residing here. Thank you so much, first of all, for organizing such a good seminar, relevant and really very timely. And thank you both for brilliant presentations. I have a follow-up question on sanctions as an instrument. Might there be that they are not that effective because they were not targeted enough, or that there are too many loopholes in implementing those? And if not, if everything goes well, what is the alternative as an instrument to try to deter or change the behavior or do something about the Russia's behavior?
As one of the slides from the previous panel showed, that the amount of gas bought in EU from Russia was about to be just about equivalent with, but now it's not pipeline gas, it's LNG gas because it's not part of the sanctions. So yes, the sanctions regime is not perfect. But also have a look at Russia. It's a very big country. It has long border that you would have to be able to control if you were to control what comes into Russia. And that's, my opinion, a long shot, very hard. On the other hand, in the overall perspective, I think it will have an effect, but in the long run. But that's sort of on the ability of Russia to keep its position as a great power, also militarily, in the very long run, 5, 10, 15 years ahead. Could you have more targeted sanctions that would deter Russia in this situation? I don't know. I think it has the side effect of pushing Russia further towards China, but it also has the side effect on China that they are not very willing to work too much together with Russia. So it's a hard instrument to use, and it's hard to use it to change government policy in a country which is in what they believe an existential fight in Ukraine and against the West.
Thank you.
Nothing to add.
I'm now going to, there's a lot of people actually want to come in, which is great. I'm now going to take questions in twos, or actually I might even go threes. So I'm going to go the lady there, the lady at the back, and the gentleman here. So the lady there.
Hi, yes, Genevieve Fuganati from the U.S. Embassy, and thank you as well for a really excellent morning and interesting discussions. I have actually two questions, one for each of our speakers. And the first one tags on to the question of regime change, and going back to the security dilemma that you described in your talk. And after 20 years, I think, of the West trying to build confidence, kind of break the security dilemma without success, what do you see as an option, or what are the opportunities that we would have out there in order to prevent this from continuing to spiral? And then my second question is for Kristian, and that is, as we look at the defense agreement and the framework that was agreed upon, and now the amendments that are under negotiation right now, do you see the political will and then also the discipline within the Danish defense to address these challenges that are out there in order to make the changes that are needed?
Thank you. The lady at the back.
Yeah, it's very much a continuation. My name is Sophie. I work with defense and cybersecurity governance from PA Consulting and sit on the board of the Danish Chamber of Commerce. I would very much like to understand your thoughts on how to approach peace negotiations with Russia, and if there is a world where this is even possible at this state, potentially exploring future scenarios. What would peace negotiations look like if it becomes more nationalist versus if there is an open door, so to say, to communicate with a more neutral party such as Michael, even though he needs to remain agreeable. How to approach those peace negotiations.
Thank you. And the third one, this gentleman here.
Patrick Warsag, I'm the head of mission at the Polish embassy here in Copenhagen. I have a question concerning what you have termed as the Danish Zeitenwende. You mentioned the political and the military challenges, but I have a question concerning the challenges linked to the Danish arms industry, and especially on the balance that this will necessitate between increased cooperation with other allies and partners, and the rebuilding of certain capabilities here internally in Denmark.
Thank you. There's a set of good questions for you both there.
First, the question on how to prevent the security dilemma from spiraling out of control. Well, that's hard. I'm sorry, but that's what history tells us. That's why there's a whole theory on, especially this logic, that's because it's so strong. I think one key part is to understand how your own actions, affect the other part. So if you move troops closer to the border, what effect will it have on the other side? Will it deter, or will it do more than deter? Will it look like an attack, so that the opponent will have to move first? That depends, of course, on where troop movements or where military equipment is put, etc. And that's why I highlight the Murmansk area as one of the most, or one of the areas where Russia feels very vulnerable. I think that the membership of NATO for Finland and Sweden, as I said, will increase the feeling of risk or of uncertainty on the Russian side. And when they have the time to think about it, or they are thinking about it now, but they don't have the means to do anything about it, but then they will increase their defense posture in that area again. Right now it's empty, the bases are basically empty up there. And they will have to think on how to be able to defend their second strike capability, because that's the survival of the Russian state, basically, and that's what they debate about. And that makes it hard in the sense that, and very important for us to understand how movement of our troops or movement of US B-1 bombers in Finland, in northern Norway, affects the Russian side. It of course deters, but does it deter too much? That's the basic point. Should I take the...
Why don't you take all the questions as a group? Yeah. Anything, you don't have to answer all of them, but whatever you want to say about it, and then I'll go to Kristian.
Negotiations with Russia from the Western side, I think we should... I think the Ukrainians should have the ability or the pleasure of saying when they are ready to negotiate. At least that's the only time when there's any chance of having an agreement of some sort. Of course, I hope that it will happen soon, but I fear that it will not happen soon. I don't see any wavering in Kremlin, be that unrealistic or not, but in the public rhetoric from Putin and from the whole elite, they have time to wait until the U.S. support of Ukraine, as they expect or hope, will fall when Trump is elected next time. They debate that very much. They are very certain of at least falling support. In other areas, can you cooperate with Russia at the present time? I see that as very hard. In a sense, if you look at the atrocities that the forces are committing in Ukraine, and if you interpret the undersea explosions of Nord Stream or Baltic Connector as Russian operations, I don't know whether they are or not. But if you do that, how can you negotiate with a country that does that? It'll take time before that's a possibility. You of course have to talk to them. You should have telephone channels to them so you can talk to them and deconflict accidents. But that's another case or another discussion.
Thank you, Kristian.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight those two things. Going back to Jørgen's point about the security dilemma and technology and geography, of course, is also based on trust and communication. And we have very, very little of both of those in addition to the tense situation. So, Gunnar, your question of whether there's sort of political will or whatever you want to call it, to do what is needed. Of course, that's also a political question. What is needed? What does that actually mean? And I think a lot of the debates is precisely about that. Right? I think the budget is there, and that is going to remain. At least we'll see whether it gets higher, but it's not going to get lower. I can tell you that, probably with relatively high significance. I think the problem is also that there's a lot of things that needs to be reconsidered or thought through again in the Danish armed forces. I think the problem is, in the Danish case, more so than in the other Nordic countries that are also investing heavily in building up their armed forces. At least they are, that Denmark, to a larger extent than those, also are in a process of having to reorganize and rethink, right? So it's both a rethink and a rebuild at the same time, and that is a complicated process, especially, again, going back to the issue of trust, where the political trust in the Danish armed forces actually being able to spend the money is perhaps less than it ideally should have been. That also makes the political or civil-military relations or civil-military dialogue a bit more complicated. So it's a difficult question for me to answer. Yes, there will be enough will to put through, but it is complicated and it's going to take a long time. Then there was a question on arms industry. If we had this debate 5 years ago, I would say that there were two things driving Danish investments, arms investment. One was price, other one was alliance relationships. Now I think there's also a support of indigenous Danish industrial capacity, both from a security of supply perspective, but also from if we're going to invest 2% of GDP, maybe we should ensure that not all of them end up in the Lockheed Martin's shareholders, but some of them actually also used within the Danish state. So I think there are those three considerations now, and of course, with the opening up for even more Danish cooperation in the EU, that might also change some of the perspectives as well.
Jørgen had a very quick point to
I have a
add.
comment on the Zeitenwende. I don't see a Zeitenwende in.
You don't?
No, I see it in the tasks that are there for the Danish defense forces to solve or to direct its forces towards. I don't see that. I don't see it in the threat perception in the Danish public elite.
Okay.
That's why I mean the budget increase is 2% is hit by 2030. That doesn't, to me, that's not. Hey, this is dangerous. We have to do something about it right now. It's not perceived as an existential threat.
That was why I compared it to the Germans, right?
As the discussion hots up, I'm going to take my last round of questions. I've seen a couple of people from our advisory board. I've got one more. I'll take three more questions. Firstly, James from our advisory board.
James Oates. About an hour ago, Jens Stoltenberg said that if the interconnector is proven to be an attack, then NATO has to do something about it. Escalation in this spiral of instability is a clear threat. What do you think he should do?
Good question. David Liddington, just to those you don't know, David was European Minister in the British Conservative government, and we welcome him very much as a member of our advisory board. David.
Thank you, Charles. Both presentations rested on an assumption about the continued commitment of the United States to the security and defence of Europe. What's the thinking in Danish military and political circles about the risk of US taking a more isolationist turn within the next 18 months? What could this Danish thinking on what might European allies do to try to head off that possibility? And how would Denmark think about managing the consequences if the United States were to say we want to cut a deal with you?
Thank you. And our final question.
Yes, Philip Laskin, I work for Rasmussen Global, the consultancy of former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen. I want to ask you, how do you view the prospects of, and maybe more interestingly, the potential Russian reaction to extending Article 5 coverage to parts of Ukrainian territory not currently under Russian occupation?
Okay, I'm going to ask both of you to respond both to those three questions, but also any concluding remarks either of you would like to make following this conversation, and a very interesting set of contributions from yourselves. Which of you would like to kick off? Kristian, why don't you go first?
Now we got to the hard questions all of a sudden, right? I think I'll start up with the question on the US continued commitment, because that's the easy one. Yes, then Jørgen can take the two other ones. No, I think, to be honest, when one looks at the defense budgets, I think the only country in Europe that has really sort of taken into consideration the risk or the possibility that the US might radically change its position is Poland. So I think Denmark is hedging its bets, like everybody else, on that the US will, in some form or fashion, still form the backbone of a Western security system. I think to a certain extent that a lot of European states have locked in their support to Europe, their support to Ukraine in such a fashion that a lessened US commitment may not be enough for the whole thing to crumble. I may be wrong, but at least that's one possible scenario. I think but Denmark is perhaps one of the most transatlantic countries you can find in Europe, right? So therefore, we have not thought through what will happen if that transatlantic relations is cut.
May I take over on that
Yes.
question? I think you're absolutely right. I think there's no. It's the thing that we do not want to talk about, that situation, basically. And I think that the Danish political elite hasn't even acknowledged that we are in a great power competition situation. I mean, the smart thing for a small state to do in a bipolar or multipolar world where there's great power competition is to keep a low profile. That's not what you do when you have the Prime Minister sitting in a F-16 with Zelensky in the driving seat. That's not a low profile. That's the policy that we used to do in the hot wars in Afghanistan and Iraq in order to get be seen by the U.S. But you're not supposed to be seen if the big brother is not going to come and help you in that crisis situation. So that's something we don't think about.
And on the current NATO challenges following Stoltenberg's statement earlier on, or possibly extending Article 5 to parts of Ukraine, any comments on either of those?
But I think both the situation underline why the security dilemma thinking is so important, right? Because you want to be clear and firm, but you don't want to risk to escalate too much. And I would like to be sort of in the room where Stoltenberg and his staff contemplate what they should do and how they should react, because it needs to be calibrated. And now he said that he will react, right? So in that sense, he's also sort of painting himself up into a corner. The whole basic point of NATO is the credibility of the extended nuclear deterrence. And you want to be really careful about where and how you extend that deterrence, because you need to be sure that not only you, but also your opponent think it's credible. So extending some kind of security guarantee to somewhere in Ukraine, of course, could have the effect of deterring Russian conventional activity in that area, making it easier for Ukraine to continue its fight against Russia. But it could also be seen as an opportunity to test the credibility of Article 5. So I would be careful.
Thank you, Jørgen.
I think a NATO policy on Ukraine would, to defend Ukraine or parts of Ukraine, wouldn't be in effect until after a solid peace, which is trustworthy. And when can that be? Depends on who sits in the Kremlin. So it's and what kind of regime it will be. So that's a long shot, I think. The Baltic Connector thing, yes, what to do? You have to do something that deters. If it's Russia, well, I haven't seen any data on it yet, and that's usually the policy that you follow. That's why we haven't heard anything about the examinations of the Nord Stream 2 from the Danish and Swedish side and so forth. But if you follow that logic, you have to know who did it, and if you then if NATO steps in, what should it do? Well, it has to be trustworthy, Kristian says, but what can you do in that area being trustworthy? You can't, like in the Mediterranean, move in a battle group of US ships. You might enhance the surveillance of that area. That wouldn't be so threatening to Russia. You might enhance the patrol along these lines, but we only have so many ships and vessels, Navy vessels, and there's lot of infrastructure to control. So I don't know what to do. Sorry.
Well, that's
I
very
don't know what
appropriate.
the answer will be. to
I
that.
don't know. It's perhaps an appropriate moment to end. I would firstly like to thank both Jørgen and Kristian for what I think has been a fantastic panel, second panel today. Thank you both very much indeed. And it is a fantastic panel following a fantastic panel earlier this morning, so I also want to thank our other three panelists earlier on this morning. I think we've had a really tremendous session this morning. I'm very pleased about the way this event has gone. I want to thank all of you for coming. We've got a great range of people here, which has been very valuable. I want again to thank the Embassy and the various people from the Embassy who've contributed to making this work, which has been extremely effective. I can tell you that from the point of view of our programme, we certainly will do further events like this in the future. Some of you might be interested to know that the Danish Embassy in London has been interested in doing a similar event in the first half of next year, obviously for an audience principally based in London. But we really thank all of you for making all this work in what I think has been a tremendously effective way. So thank you all very much. And as I say, you will be able to see the recording of this on our website. I don't know, 2 or 3 days from now, I would think. Thank you very much indeed.